Okay, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar, Investing in American Transit. Our presentation for today was developed by REMI Business Development Analyst Aisha Blackshear and Associate 1, Jim Clark Stewart. Our speaker today, Mr. Jim Stewart, is a member of our business development team and works with our taxation and fiscal analysis networks to provide economic modeling support. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity to have your questions answered. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A submission portal, and our presenter will answer them following the presentation. At this time, I will hand it off to Jim to begin the presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim. I'll be taking you through this presentation. Unfortunately, Gaisha was indisposed today. She's traveling, so I'll be doing this one alone. So yeah, let's get right into it. All right. So yeah, let's just go through a quick introduction of what the Invest in America Act is, why it's relevant now, and what's in it. All right. So before we talk about the content of it, now I think we should talk a little bit about who we are at REMI and why we're well suited to analyzing this topic. So we are the nation's leader in dynamic economic policy analysis. We do this at the local, state, and national level. And we have been sort of from the start committed to improving the lives of everyone through conducting rigorous and quantitative economic policy analysis that will enable policymakers to make better decisions and understand the effects of their policies before they happen. We were founded in 1980 on that very principle, the idea that that policymakers should test their ideas before they implement them. So yeah. So we've worked with quite a few different sorts of clients. We with all of them are working towards the goal of improving public policy, and we build our models sort of custom to any locality or the whole country, broken up into whatever divisions are necessary for that analysis. It's from the sub-county level all the way up to whole of country, and we've worked from clients ranging from universities, consultancies, to government agencies, and the European Commission itself. So we've worked with a very broad range of clients, and our breadth of expertise is pretty wide. So yeah, here's a quick overview of what we'll be doing today, and why the Invest in America Act is important. So yeah, so the Invest in America Act is really the basis for the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was just passed by the Senate today. It just passed, I think, 6930, and it passed very recently in the day, just like an hour or two ago. And it's a surface transportation and water infrastructure bill that, depending on how you break it down, includes between about 500 and a little over $700 billion in new funding. And it's really motivated by a few different factors here. So first, it's meant to create jobs, not only through the direct stimulative effect of the spending, which is obvious. You can do that with pretty much any type of spending, but improving, but also by, in the long term, improving employers' access to labor and input goods, which reduces their costs, increases the pool of talent they can draw from, and really helps sort of increase the size of the job market in the long term, and increases the competitiveness of regions across the United States and the country as a whole. Also, it's meant to help bring more regions, especially those that have been left behind, back in to the sort of the gains of the economy, really spread around the growth that has been happening in the past several decades, and help sort of broaden the benefits of economic growth by connecting communities that have traditionally either been underserved or just are very remote to the national and regional economy, to allow them to participate and gain from economic activity. Also, there's a substantial amount of funding that's dedicated to fighting climate change and really just facing down the consequences of it by both improving infrastructure to help reduce carbon emissions, and also to make infrastructure more resilient, so as to make it less susceptible to the negative consequences that we'll be seeing going forward in the coming decades. And also, it's really meant to address safety issues. As some of you may have heard on the radio lately, there's a sort of a problem in this country with pedestrian fatalities and sort of just safety in our transportation infrastructure in general, and also safety with regard to our water supply in certain areas of the country. Now, that's not universally true, but there are some sort of infrastructural safety issues that this bill is meant to tackle and help make our transit and water systems safer for the public and reduce those unnecessary mortalities. Slide, please. So yeah, there's two key important consequences from this. First of all, there's the water and climate effect. So if this is done right, it can improve road efficiency and transform the materials that are used to build roads and other infrastructure, which can reduce the carbon footprint of the transportation and commuting economy. And it can increase the quality and safety of our water supply and improve health outcomes in a lot of different communities across the country. And then there's the traditional sort of economic infrastructure effects that you'd see when transportation infrastructure is invested in. So there's the improvements to transit will, of course, as I said before, improve sort of producers' access to labor and commodities, which can help employers produce at a higher level at lower costs, and that will, if done correctly, increase productivity and result in reduced real prices. And by increasing regional interconnectedness, it can help really bring up some of those left behind regions and bring them up to parity more with the most prosperous parts of the country. So yeah, I'm going to take you through a brief overview of the appropriations that are included in this legislation. It's slightly different from the final infrastructure bill, as it's one of the sort of predecessor pieces of legislation, and we prepared this before the final infrastructure bill was hashed out and was sort of passed. So you'll notice a few differences if you're familiar with the line-by-line appropriations. For example, there's just not any broadband money in this piece of legislation. It's focused more explicitly on physical infrastructure like transit and water. So here, here we can see the sort of roads, bridges, safety, EV charging infrastructure. This is really your motorist related infrastructure that's related to how cars interact with the economy and how people use vehicles to get from place to place. So there's general roads and motor transit is the largest funding item in here by far, 288.5. We can see that tails off pretty quickly. There's quite a lot for bridges and decarbonization and green materials, and then EV charging and reconnecting communities is much smaller. Just to clarify, reconnecting communities is really about just sort of fixing some issues that were created by earlier infrastructure projects, particularly in the sort of mid-20th century, that ended up dividing certain communities by building pieces of infrastructure in the middle of them. And that's meant to sort of address those issues. Yeah, so here we can see the public transportation appropriations. It's pretty bare bones, but not a small amount of money. It's just there's not that many pots it goes into. There's just general grants to public transportation agencies. So that's your buses, your and just funding the local and state agencies. And then there's rural and high poverty transportation, which is much smaller, but it's sort of a long-term funding allocation, which is at a level of $50 million per year. And what that's meant to do is help people in rural and high poverty communities that don't have access to transportation, either in the form of cars or just don't have very good connections to local public transit networks, get from place to place. So here we can see. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a typo here. This is rail. This is rail funding. Ignore the title there. I'm very sorry. There's the general rail appropriations is at a level of 63 billion. That can be anything from repairing railroads, improving the quality of rail lines, buying new rolling stock, all of that sort of thing. And then they're tripling the funding of Amtrak to $32 billion per year, which is a pretty big pot of money for Amtrak. So here we have our water infrastructure. The first part of it, this is one of the biggest features of the Invest in America Act, which makes it different from some of the other infrastructure legislation that's been brought to the floor in both houses of Congress. And it has, you can see quite a lot of different things here. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which is the largest source of federal money for drinking water infrastructure, is funded at a level of $53 billion per year. Sorry, $53 billion total. And you can see there's a lot of money towards replacing that lead water lines, which is very important, at least in the minds of policymakers, because of course lead poisoning can lead to a lot of bad health outcomes. And places like Flint, Michigan, have had pretty sort of horrible outcomes with water lines in the recent past. And we can see there's like assistance to people for water bills. There's water debt relief, which is directly sort of related to the decline in incomes and employment that's been a result of the pandemic. And there's just some other miscellaneous funding that exists there at the end. So here's the wastewater infrastructure, which is another part of the water infrastructure, but it's really just meant to process water that's already flowed through the economy and society, and is being either dumped somewhere else or being sort of recycled into the water system. And there's the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Again, these big sort of pots of money for state governments to use are sort of a big part of the water infrastructure component of this legislation. And you can see it's funded at a very high level, and everything else sort of tails off after that. Of note, there's alternative water sourcing, but that is pretty small. And yeah, I think we're good to go to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to take you through here the methodology that we're using for this simulation. I'm going to talk about both of the models that we're going to use, and I'm just going to quickly talk you through how I sort of inputted the variables into the models to get the results that I'm going to present. So yeah, so the first model that we're using in this simulation is Transite. It's our transportation and infrastructure model. It is the premier software solution for some evaluations of economic impacts of transportation policy. It's been grounded in over 20 years of experience modeling transportation-related issues, and it can be used for all sorts of transportation and infrastructure policy. And it is only one half of the very special model we're using today. Actually, this is something I'm quite excited about. We're using a combination model of both E3+, which is our energy and environment model, and this Transite. And that gives us some unique capabilities here. So yeah, I just go on over to E3+. So yeah, E3+ is also the premier solution for dynamic modeling of the economic effects of environmental and energy policy. And it really gives us the ability to capture a lot of the carbon and other pollutant effects on the economy and society. And it's used by all sorts of decision makers in evaluating the effects of these energy policies on the economy and on society and demographics. And what we've done here is we put both of these models together in one software application, and that allows us to get a lot of specialized outputs that we wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And the variables we're using today are just an investment in sort of the related fields, like roads, bridges, like EV stations. There's the spending, and then there's the improvements to labor and commodity access, which we've modeled, and we've also modeled the reduction in carbon emissions from the sort of improvements that they've made to the materials used in infrastructure and the other spending they've allocated for reducing carbon emissions. All right, so here I'm going to take you through the results that we've found from this simulation. There's quite a few of them, and I'm just going to bring some graphs up on screen and then talk you through what we're seeing and why I think we're seeing it, and what that might mean for different regions. So we can see here, this is a GDP by region graph. There's a lot going on here, so I'll just talk people through it really quickly. So we can see a big spike up in GDP compared to the baseline. So what's happening here is we're comparing the level of GDP to its level in a baseline scenario where the spending doesn't happen. So the economy is not growing at 4.8% per year and not like continuing to grow super fast. It's just elevated above those levels and continues to be elevated above those levels. You can see there's a big disparity between like different regions. You can see that the Plains and Great Lakes regions benefit a lot, and that's due to their sort of specialization in manufacturing sectors that are heavily dependent on having like access to a wide variety of high quality and low cost commodity goods to manufacture their products, and having good access to the national labor force, which these two regions have struggled to maintain, especially as some of our legacy infrastructure is decayed. So the comparative effects of that are much more heavily felt in these manufacturing intensive sort of left behind quote unquote regions. And it's least felt in the Mideast region, which in the BEA 8 regions includes New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, I believe. And that, that's an area that's very built up, and it's, in most of the population centers, they have predominantly, not always, but good access to the labor force, sort of specialized in financial and other business services, so they're not really benefiting as much from hard infrastructure in the way that more manufacturing intensive regions might. And you can also see that the Southeast gains a lot, but the Southwest doesn't as much. The Southwest, you can see that's just, and a lot of that's just because the Southwest has a heavy specialization in the capital intensive sort of extractive sectors, particularly oil, and that's not really benefited as much by increased access to commodity goods. It's really like the things that are going to really benefit that the most are access to like cheap access to capital stock. And I'm going to take you right over to a comparative graph now, where you can see what would happen if we were to reduce capital costs instead of improving commodity access and labor access. So here we can see the Southwest does very well, and this is again, the access to those capital goods are really important for the sort of extractive sectors, because the main inputs for those are like large, expensive, complicated capital goods like oil rigs, construction equipment for setting up those pieces of infrastructure. So reducing your capital costs instead of investing in this sort of infrastructure would produce more gains in regions that are specialized in your extractive industries. But again, that's not what we're actually doing in this scenario. I just thought this is an interesting comparison to provide so that we could sort of see what would have happened if we focused this spending on improving a different aspect of the business and economic environment. So here we can see output by industry. This is a very crowded graph. Don't worry, you don't need to look at all of it. There's just a couple of things I want to talk you through here. So we see a huge spike in construction. That's because of the direct effect of the spending. It's generating demand for the construction of roads, rail, bridges, infrastructure. Investing in water processing facilities. That's so construction benefits very heavily from that, but then it tails off quickly as the actual spending on that sort of disappears. But we see the biggest consistent winner here is manufacturing, again, because of that commodity access and that labor access, because those are really important for manufacturing players. And we can see a small decline at the bottom, and we could in mining and some other things. There's some industries that lose out here, but really most of them see gains. It's just which ones are the biggest, which ones are the smallest. So here we can see population by region. This is interesting. This is not showing net population growth. This is showing difference in population on a given year versus the baseline estimates. And we can see that the biggest gainer here is the plain states. The plain states, because of those improvements in labor and commodity access, see a lot of improvements in manufacturing, and then see a lot of economic in-migration. And that comes from both, that comes from lots of other regions. And some of those regions end up losing out because, these already built up prosperous regions, while they're better off on net relative to no Invest in America Act, they're less better off comparatively than these sort of left behind states become, because the improvements you see in the left behind states are relatively larger, and that results in some economic in-migration towards them. It doesn't necessarily mean that their population growth rate is going to eclipse what you see in the far west, or what you see in other parts that are more quickly growing. It's just they, relatively speaking, are the biggest beneficiaries from this policy. So we can see relative delivered price. We can see pretty much everything declines here, and that's just because the labor and commodity access improvements, while they hit different industries differently, pretty much everything gets a little bit cheaper to produce when you have easier access to labor and your input goods. So that's going to be a long-term reduction in prices, and we see that like the affordability of everything is improving on net as a result of this policy. And we can see energy consumption here. Now, although there are some efforts to reduce the carbon intensity of transit infrastructure, you're still seeing a big uptick in energy consumption in all sectors, particularly industrial, which is being driven by manufacturing here. And that's just because you're seeing like a lot, the economy is bigger than under the status quo when this infrastructure program happens. So there's going to be more energy consumption, barring anything that changes the energy intensity of the economy, which is not being modeled in this scenario. Although there might be policy that does that, this is not what's being modeled here. So again, the model assumes that the energy intensity of a dollar GDP remains constant, and you're seeing the increase in energy consumption just as a result. And yeah, so here's our so let's talk through a few of our key conclusions here and what this could mean for different areas going forward. So our overall conclusion is this is a win for economic output. It created significant gains in GDP, employment, and wages relative to a baseline where this doesn't happen. Prices are reduced over the long term because of improved infrastructure. Access to labor and input goods means firms are more productive and can produce more for the same cost. That means your real prices are going to decline. For region by region, the Midwest benefits a lot. That is your Great Lakes and Plains regions, and they gained very healthily along with the South, because these are the areas that really stand to gain the most in improving labor and commodity access, both because the Midwest is generally specialized more in manufacturing than some other regions, and because infrastructure quality and just the quantity of infrastructure is lower in some of these areas relative to the population. So improving infrastructure there is going to sort of yield a greater relative improvement. And the richest and most built-up regions don't gain quite as much because, again, they're specialized in a lot of these business services areas that don't really have a problem with labor access in a lot of these big cities. I mean, there's huge surpluses of qualified employees in a lot of these major areas, and even where there aren't, they can typically pull in migrants pretty easily now, and they also just generally are closer to so they're specialized in these areas that don't sort of need this as much, and they are already they're already very wealthy. So improving the access to this is going to, by a certain amount, improving labor and commodity access by a certain amount is going to benefit the areas that have less access, more relatively speaking. By industry, it does benefit most industries on net. There's no going around that, but there are some relative winners and losers. Again, manufacturing is a huge long-term winner. It went up even in 2060, where this infrastructure is depreciated the most out of any year in the simulation. We just simulated it depreciating over time at a constant rate. It's still up. I think the manufacturing sort of mega sector overall is up over 10%, if I remember that correctly, and wholesale and retail trade are up 4 or 5% each respectively, and capital-intensive industries like extractive are not as sort of benefited as much because, again, this doesn't do much to change the cost of capital goods. although the prices go down a little bit because the manufacturers of those capital goods are more efficient, it's not felt quite as heavily by the extractive industries as directly, like as it is by the manufacturers, who are the biggest beneficiaries. And business services don't feel it much because, again, they're concentrated in areas where labor access is already fairly good, and they're, the commodity inputs are not as big of a deal for them, so it's not as big of a boon for them. And employment services actually sees a modest decline, and that's because labor access improves, so companies don't have to spend as much hiring people to help them find workers. They can do that more easily on their own, so that's just something that falls off a bit. And so our energy and environmental inclusions are, so energy demand in all sectors increases pretty constantly. It sort of tails off or levels off towards the end because the benefits of the infrastructure start to decay over time as the quality of the infrastructure deteriorates. Barring sort of new reinvestments down the line, which we did not model, as there aren't extant proposals to have major reinvestment projects yet. So that's not something that was in the model. And we also kept the assumption that this doesn't change your megawatt hours per unit of GDP, because that's not something that's part of this policy. We talk about carbon emissions, which could from transportation and commuting, but that's not really affecting the energy consumption of most of these industries. And carbon reductions from EV generations, from EV generation infrastructure and increased demand for EVs that results from that, because it's easier to charge your electrical vehicles with this new national network of charging stations. That could very easily be overwhelmed by increases in carbon emissions just from the economy being larger than it would otherwise be, because it's not like the economy, because this doesn't really decarbonize most of the economy. It helps reduce some of the emissions related to transportation and commuting, but it doesn't really affect the energy mix of most of the economy. These EV charging stations do yield some reduction in carbon emissions versus internal combustion engine cars, but it doesn't really affect the power mix that is sending the electricity to these EV charging stations. So again, the increased economic output might actually result in a slight increase in total carbon emissions, but again, other federal policy and state policy could change that going down the line. So yeah, I hope that that sort of answered a lot of the questions you had about this policy. I'll now sort of go over to talking about why economic modeling is important, and what we can do sort of for various types of clients going forward. So economic policy is really important for clarifying what's going to happen when a policy decision is taken. I think this might be one of the most, if not the most important reasons to do economic modeling. You want to ensure that your public policy is evidence-based and it's serving the sort of full diversity of the constituents which the government's serving. So it's actually creating broad-based benefits and is going to achieve the intended effect. It also is useful for anyone who is not crafting policy but is looking to predict the outcomes of policies that are being sort of handed down to them. It's important for both sort of smaller governments and private actors to understand what the policy environment is going to cause to happen in their region, and so that if an unintended negative consequence is coming their way, they can make the necessary adjustments to mitigate its effects and understand exactly what mitigation steps will have the best sort of chance of counteracting any negative effects that may result from policy decisions from other agencies. It also helps to ensure that resources are being allocated efficiently and that policymakers are getting the best bang for their buck when they're spending taxpayer dollars. You can also use economic modeling to inform policy with standard rigorous metrics rather than sort of rhetoric or ideological concerns that don't have a basis in clear quantitative economic evidence, and you can sort of help sell stakeholders with hard evidence and facts that can communicate how policy changes will actually benefit their communities, rather than just selling them on, this is, what our party platform is, or this is what the government's doing, and it serves this sort of ideological goal. You get that really rigorous quantitative sell that you can give to your stakeholders. So here's just a few of the areas where we've been employed, and how we do it, and how we tend to approach the projects we're brought on for. So we really provide a software solution that that easily quantifies and calculates the effect of policy changes, so that they can be communicated to stakeholders and decision makers in a way that is concise and convincing. And we have been doing this since 1980. All of our equations are peer reviewed, and we use data sources that are, the national gold standard for their categories, BLS, DEA, Census Bureau data sources that are inputted into our model, and then we use those peer reviewed equations to generate the dynamic effects of policy changes and make long run projections. And all of our equations are public. You can download them right off our website. We're very straightforward about how we arrive at our conclusions. There's no smoke and mirrors. You can see how the model works right down into the guts of it, and you can just download the file off our website. And we've been used all across the country. We've been used in my home region of New England. We helped analyze the effects of a Maryland corporate tax cut that went through. We did Medicare expansion in North Carolina. We've done manufacturing facilities in Arkansas. We're used by the Texas State Legislature as part of their statutory requirement for economic impact analysis for any appropriations legislation. And we've done work out in the mountain states, the West Coast. The list goes on. We really have we are familiar with and have partnered with pretty much every state and region in the country at some point or another. So here's just a little bit more about why economic modeling can be a useful tool for you and your organization. It can help agencies, as I've talked about before, understand the effects of policies before they actually are implemented and before those effects are seen. So the agencies can be ready to deal with the consequences of policies, and also be ready to maybe tweak or sort of backtrack on policies that have been found to not be as good, and alter them to be more useful to achieving the goals that are desired. So it can help guide the policy making process by creating a sort of formalized and quantitative decision-making process by running everything through the model before you actually make a decision, getting it right the first time, measuring twice and cutting once. It can be used by advocates to help block or pass legislation through using convincing quantitative evidence, and it can sort of modernize the evaluation process that's used by agencies to evaluate the decisions before they're made. This could be really important for bidders for grants for projects that will be funded by the infrastructure bills, whether it be the bipartisan one that just passed the Senate, or the budget measure that's coming down the pipe. They'll want to demonstrate how accretive their projects are to the local economy and the national economy, and that they'll be able to benefit a broad range of communities, and help the country and their region remain competitive. So that having that quantitative narrative really helps sell that that bid to the people who gatekeep access to those pots of money. And policy organizations and regional planners really need to be able to model the effects of policies, add quantitative rigor to proposals that they make, because you need to be able to show the final decision makers or the potential investors in your region that that there are clear benefits to the stakeholders, and that these things are not just sort of something that's a selling point that you've come up with, but something that's sort of quantitatively and observably true.